The metallic scent of gunpowder hangs heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the coppery smell rising from the detective's body on the floor. Above him stands a father, the architect of this ruin, his weapon still warm, his shadow stretching long across the scene. This wasn't an act of passion. This was the result of 6 months of grief forged into a weapon, of rage refined with an engineer's precision. The system that shielded the men who broke his son was about to learn a lesson in structural failure. From the inside out, no badge, no blue wall, could protect them from the debt that was now coming due. Before we unravel how a good man was pushed to this point, drop a comment and let me know what city or state you're watching from. Does the justice system where you live feel like it protects everyone equally? If you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss a single step of this descent, and share this with someone who needs to see the true cost of a broken system. The shrill, insistent ring of the telephone sliced through the afternoon quiet of Robert Washington's office. It was an unwelcome intrusion into a world of order, a world defined by the clean lines of structural blueprints and the satisfying certainty of physics. He was reviewing the load-bearing calculations for a new community center in downtown Houston, a project he believed in, when the call came. The caller ID flashed a name that was clinically sterile and yet instantly terrifying. Houston General Hospital. Mr. Washington? The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm and professional. The practiced tone of someone who delivers life-altering news with the same cadence as a weather report. This is Nurse Patterson from Houston General. We need you to come to the emergency department regarding your son. Daniel? The blueprints blurred. The precise numbers and angles dissolved into meaningless squiggles. My son! Robert's own voice sounded distant, a stranger's voice in his own ears. What happened? Is he okay? Just tell me. There was a slight, measured pause on the other end. The doctor will provide a full update upon your arrival. Sir, I can only confirm he's in our care. Please drive safely. The line clicked dead, the finality of it an insult. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, suffocating. Robert stood, his hands still resting on the receiver, his knuckles white. The blueprints on his desk, a testament to a world built on rules and predictable outcomes, seemed to mock the violent, incomprehensible chaos that was now erupting in his chest. He grabbed his keys, the metallic jingle abnormally loud in the sudden stillness. He barely remembered muttering an explanation to his assistant as he left, his mind already a maelstrom of worst-case scenarios, a frantic, 15-minute drive that felt like both an eternity and a single horrifying second. The controlled chaos of the emergency room enveloped him the moment the automatic doors hissed open. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something metallic, like old pennies. It was the smell of a place where life is held by a thread, and Robert felt a primal urge to turn and flee, to run back to the ordered world he had left behind. But his son was here. A nurse at the intake desk directed him to Trauma Room 3. The name itself felt like a physical blow. He pushed the door open and the world stopped. His son, his Daniel, lay unconscious on a gurney, a pale island in a sea of humming machinery. Tubes sprouted from his mouth and arms, tethering him to life. His face, the beloved face Robert had watched grow from infancy to the cusp of manhood, was a swollen, discolored mask that was barely recognizable. One eye was completely swollen shut, a grotesque purple plum. Robert could see, even from the doorway, that his jaw was visibly, unnaturally misaligned. The steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor beside the bed was the only reassurance that his son's heart was still beating. He remembered Daniel that morning, a flash of a lopsided grin as he slung a backpack over one shoulder. A promise to be home for dinner. A casual, "Love you, Dad." How could the handful of hours between then and now hold this wreckage? The engineer in him, the part that craved logic and reason, tried to surface, tried to catalog the damage as if that could somehow contain the horror. Multiple facial fractures, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a traumatic brain injury. The clinical terms the doctor would later use were already screaming in his mind, but they were abstract and useless in the face of the broken reality of his child. Two police officers stood near the doorway, their solid presence an incongruous element in the medical tableau. The older, stockier one stepped forward. "Mr. Washington, I'm Officer Kevin Cooper," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This is Officer Wilson. We understand this is a difficult situation." He gestured vaguely toward Daniel's bed with a thumb. "Your son was apprehended in possession of an illegal substance. When we attempted the arrest, he chose to escalate the situation." Robert's mind struggled to connect the words to the boy on the bed. Escalate? He weighs 160 pounds. He's on the honor roll. He wouldn't escalate anything. Cooper's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Sometimes the ones you least expect are the most unpredictable. "We're trained to read the signs, sir." He wasn't complying. When a suspect resists, we are authorized to use necessary force to ensure compliance. Officer safety is our primary concern. The words were a wall, smooth and impenetrable. Robert looked from Cooper's impassive face to the other officer. Scott Wilson, younger and seemingly less comfortable, refused to meet Robert's gaze. He stared at a scuff mark on his boot, his jaw tight. A flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, or shame, crossed his face for a split second before he schooled his expression back to a mask of professional neutrality. "I want to see the body cam footage," Robert demanded, his voice shaking with a rage that was beginning to burn through the fog of shock. "I want to see what happened." "Unfortunately," Cooper said, the word carrying no hint of regret, "there was a malfunction with my body camera during the incident. All appropriate reports have been filed." It was another wall, higher this time. Later, adrift in the sterile hallway while a doctor, a petite woman with tired eyes named Dr. Chen, examined his son. Robert leaned against a wall near the nursing station, trying to breathe. The voices of two nurses, low and routine, drifted toward him. "Can you believe that kid from the Woodlands?" one said, her voice a mix of amusement and exasperation. "The one with the designer jacket? His parents were complaining about the paperwork." The other nurse laughed softly. "For a citation, he walked out of here an hour after he came in. Meanwhile, this poor boy in Trauma 3, it's just a different set of rules, isn't it?" The first nurse sighed, the sound weary. "It's not rules. It's zip codes." The words landed like stones in the pit of Robert's stomach. Zip codes. He pushed himself off the wall and intercepted Dr. Chen as she exited Daniel's room. "The injuries," he said, his voice low and urgent, "they don't match what the officer said. This is more than necessary force. I need to see the full medical report." Dr. Chen's expression was cautious, her eyes sympathetic but guarded. "Mr. Washington, our priority right now is stabilizing your son. He is in a medically induced coma to reduce the swelling in his brain. The police have filed their report, and for anything related to the events leading up to his admission, that's the document we have to refer to." "But it's not right," Robert insisted, his voice rising. "It doesn't add up." He saw a subtle shift in the doctor's posture, a professional closing of a door. Before she could respond, a hospital security guard, a large man with a gentle face that was contradicted by the sheer bulk of his presence, moved to stand near them. He didn't look at Robert aggressively, but his proximity was a clear signal, an unspoken message. "Sir," the guard said, his voice soft, almost kind, "maybe let's go get a cup of coffee. The doctors need space to work." Robert looked from the doctor's carefully neutral face to the guard's calm, placid expression. The offer of coffee wasn't an offer. It was a command. It was the system, in its quiet, institutional way, telling him to stop asking questions. He felt the fight drain out of him, replaced by a cold, terrifying sense of isolation. His shoulders slumped in a moment of silent surrender. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The message received and understood. The lukewarm coffee sat untouched on the small formica table in the hospital cafeteria. Its bitterness a pale imitation of the taste in Robert's own mouth. The guard had been kind, his duty performed with a placid smile, but the message had been delivered with the force of a slammed door. Questions were not welcome. The official story was the only story. He sat there, surrounded by the low murmur of other families lost in their own private griefs, and understood. He could not break down this wall with raw emotion. Shouting would get him escorted out. Crying would get him pitied. He was an engineer. When faced with a structure designed to resist force, you don't keep running at it. You find its weaknesses, you find the cracks, and to do that, you need a different kind of tool. He pulled out his phone, his fingers bypassing the numbers of friends and family. He opened a web browser, his search terms precise and deliberate. Houston attorney, police brutality, best. He scrolled past the slick, corporate law firms whose websites boasted of billion-dollar settlements in patent disputes. He wasn't looking for a shark in a tailored suit. He was looking for a brawler, a fighter. A name kept appearing, attached not to advertisements, but to news articles and activist blogs. Olivia Martinez, days later. Robert sat across from her. Olivia Martinez's office was not a corner suite in a glass tower. It was a second-floor walk-up over a bustling taqueria, an office that ran on coffee and a deep, simmering anger. The air smelled of old paper and fierce determination. "Robert, look around my office," Olivia said, her voice direct, her gaze unflinching. "I have this." She gestured to a wall covered in framed, faded newspaper clippings, headlines that screamed of injustice and hard-won, fractional victories, and a phone that never stops ringing with stories just like yours. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the worn surface of her desk. "The first thing they will do is paint a picture of Daniel. Any suspension, any time he talked back in class, any post on social media they can twist. They will use it. They will build a caricature of a dangerous young man to justify what they did. They need to convince the world he deserved what he got. Our job," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "is to remind them he was a child." A week later, Olivia called. A flicker of hope, the first he'd felt in days, ignited in Robert's chest. An anonymous source had sent her a video file. It was a bystander's partial footage. Robert watched it on his laptop, his hands trembling. He saw his son, Daniel, his back against a brick wall, his hands clearly cuffed behind him. He was not struggling. He was complying. Then, he saw Officer Kevin Cooper grab his son by the shoulder and slam him face first into the wall with sickening force. The video cut out. It was proof. It was vindication. And it was a fresh, searing agony. The hope was short-lived. Olivia called again the next day. Her voice was flat, weary. The Houston Police Department was refusing to release the full, official footage from all 4 officers, citing an ongoing internal investigation. All 4, Kevin Cooper, Thomas Mills, David Sanchez, and Scott Wilson, had been placed on paid administrative leave. Paid? Robert repeated the word, the sound of it catching in his throat. It was a vacation, a reward. The system began to move, not to deliver justice, but to control the narrative. Robert saw the headline on a newsstand at the hospital gift shop while buying a bottle of water he had no intention of drinking. Teen with history of school suspensions, injured during arrest. The cheap newsprint felt toxic in his hands. The words were physical blows, reducing his brilliant, complicated son, the boy who had just been accepted to Hampton University, to a two-dimensional caricature. He called Olivia from the hospital corridor, his voice a ragged whisper. "They're crucifying him. They're putting my son on trial, and he's in a coma. How is this legal?" "It's not about legality. Robert," Olivia's voice was heavy with the exhaustion of 1,000 similar fights. "It's about narrative control. It's the court of public opinion, And right now, we're losing because their machine is bigger and louder than ours. The meeting with the district attorney's office confirmed her words. The office of Assistant DA William Collins was a fortress of paper, a dusty labyrinth where justice went to die. Stacks of manila folders leaned like tired soldiers on every available surface. Collins himself, a man with a perpetually furrowed brow, glanced at his watch twice in the first 5 minutes. He offered condolences, then laid out the reality. Proving police misconduct beyond a reasonable doubt is extraordinarily difficult. You have a partial video. Their defense will say it's taken out of context. You have your son's word against 4 decorated officers. He sighed, a sound of pure bureaucratic resignation. And let's be frank, the Police Officers Association will fund the best defense money can buy. They'll bankrupt the city to protect their own. My office, we have limited resources. We have to pick the fights we can win. Robert left the meeting with a hollow feeling in his gut. The system wasn't just indifferent, it was intimidated. It had already surrendered. The final piece fell into place a few days later, back in Olivia's cluttered office. She didn't make a show of it. She simply slid a thin, unmarked file across her desk. It wasn't an official document. It was a collection of notes, typed and handwritten, compiled from her network of activists and whistleblowers. These are the 2 prior excessive force complaints against Cooper that were buried, she said quietly. Robert opened the file. He read about a routine traffic stop that ended with a 16-year-old boy suffering a broken arm. He read about another young man, 19, stopped for trespassing in a public park after dark, an encounter that resulted in a concussion and 3 stitches. Both victims were young, Black. Both cases had been settled quietly by the city. The victims got a check, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and Cooper got a note in his file. Robert looked up from the page, but he wasn't seeing Olivia's office anymore. He was seeing a blueprint, the structure of something vast and terrible. The official reports, the media narrative, the DA's powerlessness, the paid leave, the prior complaints. They weren't separate, unrelated points of failure. They were interconnected components, engineered to work together, to absorb impact, to deflect accountability, and to protect the structure itself at all costs. He finally understood. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. A cold fury, different from the hot, grief-stricken anger he'd felt in the hospital, settled deep in his gut. It was the clear, chilling certainty of an engineer who has found a fatal design flaw. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a hunt, and his son was just the latest prey. Robert left Olivia's office that day with the thin file in his briefcase and a block of ice where his hope used to be. The cold fury he felt didn't manifest in shouting or tears. It settled into a quiet, grim resolve that insulated him from the daily onslaught of despair. The following weeks blurred into a sterile, monotonous routine. His life became the antiseptic corridors of Houston General, the rhythmic sigh of his son's ventilator, and the one-sided conversations he held with Daniel's still form. He would read to him from textbooks on civil engineering, talk about his day, and describe the progress on the community center, all while the chasm between the world he was describing and the silent reality of the hospital room grew wider and more profound. A month after the incident, during her morning rounds, Dr. Patel, a compassionate woman whose kind eyes could no longer soften the hard edges of medical reality, asked to speak with him in the hallway. "Robert," she began, her voice gentle, "we need to discuss long-term care options. Patients in prolonged comas often require specialized facilities. We can begin looking at some excellent places that..." The clinical phrase, long-term care, shattered the grim resolve he had so carefully constructed. It was a sterile euphemism for giving up, for moving his son to a place where he would be kept clean and breathing until, one day, he wasn't. It was the system, in its calm, medical, rational way, telling him that his son's life as he knew it was over. It broke something fundamental inside him. He mumbled an excuse and walked away. his legs unsteady, the ice in his gut cracking to reveal the raw, bottomless grief beneath. He made it to the hospital parking garage, the cool, exhaust-scented darkness, a welcome reprieve from the relentless fluorescent lights. He leaned against the cold concrete of his car, and the strength he had maintained for a month finally gave way. His body was racked with sobs that seemed to come from some primal place within him, guttural sounds of a pain too immense to be contained by a human frame. "You all right, brother?" The deep, steady voice startled him. Robert quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed to be seen in such a state of collapse. The man who stood a few feet away was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the disciplined posture that spoke of a military background. "Sometimes you just need to let it out away from the fluorescent lights," the man said, his voice holding no judgment, only a quiet understanding. "Vernon Lewis," he introduced himself, extending a large, calloused hand. "My niece is upstairs in oncology." Something about Charles Lewis's steady presence broke through Robert's wall of isolation. Before he knew it, the story was pouring out of him. Daniel, the police, the lies, the media, the useless DA, the doctor's words just moments ago. He laid out the whole ugly architecture of his nightmare. Charles listened, his expression grim, his gaze never wavering. When Robert finished, his voice raw, Charles nodded slowly. "My brother, Paul, was killed by police in Ferguson back in 2018. Mistaken identity, they claimed. They shot him 16 times during a routine traffic stop. The system protected them. 2. The story was delivered without melodrama, a simple statement of a horrific fact, and in it, Robert recognized the same cold, structural certainty he had discovered himself. I followed all the rules," Robert said, the words aching in his throat. "I taught him to follow all the rules. What's the point of the rules if they don't apply to everyone?" Charles looked at him, his eyes holding a profound, weary sadness. "Brother, that's the first question you ask. The last question you'll ask is, what am I going to do about it? They count on us never getting to that last question." 2 days later, Charles introduced Robert to that question's answer. He took him to a support group that met in the cramped, poorly lit basement of a community center in the 3rd Ward. The room smelled of old coffee and a quiet, stubborn resilience. People sat on mismatched folding chairs, their faces etched with a shared, familiar grief. They didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. They offered something far more valuable: witness. A woman named Helen, her hands tightly clutching a framed photograph of a smiling young woman, spoke in a low, steady voice. "They offered me a settlement for my daughter, died in custody, a wrongful death payment. They wanted me to sign a paper saying I wouldn't talk about it. They wanted to buy my silence." She looked around the room, her gaze meeting the eyes of the others. "I told them my daughter's life wasn't for sale." Robert listened, his own tragedy echoing in their stories. A father whose son was shot during a no-knock raid on the wrong address. A sister whose mentally ill brother was tased to death during a wellness check. Each story was a different verse of the same horrifying song, a litany of injustice met with official denials, media indifference, and a legal system that moved at a glacial pace. If it moved at all. He realized this wasn't just his tragedy. It was a shared, gaping wound in the heart of the community, one the system seemed designed to keep open. Hearing these stories, seeing the landscape of his own pain reflected in the faces around him, unlocked something dark and purposeful within Robert. The legal avenues were mazes with no exit. The media was a machine that fed on caricature. The internal affairs investigations were a deliberate illusion of accountability. The quiet resilience in this room was noble, but it wasn't justice. Charles's words echoed in his head. What am I going to do about it? He left the meeting that night with a new, chilling clarity. If the system was a fortress designed to protect its own, you couldn't tear it down by knocking on the front gate. You had to map its vulnerabilities. You had to find the cracks in its foundation. Later that night, in the sterile quiet of the temporary apartment he'd rented near the hospital. Robert sat down at his small desk. He pushed aside the engineering journals and hospital pamphlets. He opened his laptop and placed a new, empty notebook beside it. The methodical mind that had once designed bridges to withstand incredible stress was now being turned to a new, terrible project: deconstruction. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, then typed the first name. The white letters appeared on the dark screen, stark and absolute. Kevin Cooper. The first search for Kevin Cooper led to a dozen more, then 100. The nights began to bleed together, marked only by the shifting glow of the laptop screen on Robert's face. He moved through the digital world with the same meticulous precision he once used to navigate blueprints. He cross-referenced public records, voter registrations, property deeds, and the carelessly public social media profiles of the officers' friends and family. Each piece of data was a node, and he was connecting them, building a schematic not of a bridge, but of 4 men's lives. He was mapping their foundations to find their faults. This new, grim purpose was a shield against the grief that threatened to drown him during his waking hours at the hospital. The transformation was not a loud explosion, but a gradual erosion, like concrete worn away by a relentless, acidic tide. Some nights, he would pause his research and look down at his own hands, hands that had designed bridges to connect communities, hands that had patiently checked Daniel's algebra homework, hands that had held his wife, Maria, as she succumbed to the quiet violence of cancer. He wondered when they had started to feel like they could belong to a stranger, capable of tasks he never could have imagined. His and Maria's shared faith in a world of rules, hard work, and lawful resolution now seemed like a naive dream from a past life. That world was a ruin, and he was a surveyor picking through the rubble. The methodical dismantling of his own life began. He used cash, withdrawn in small, untraceable amounts, to rent a storage unit in a forgotten industrial park on the other side of the city. On the lease agreement, he signed a name that wasn't his. David Chen, a ghost identity borrowed from a donor list he'd seen years ago. This dusty 10 by 10 concrete box became his operational base, a place where the man named Robert Washington ceased to exist. Next, he put his family home on the market. The real estate agent, a kind woman with sympathetic eyes, assumed the decision was born of grief, of a need to escape the painful memories held within its walls. Robert let her believe it. With cold detachment, he packed away the photographs of Maria and Daniel, the physical artifacts of a life that was now over. He was not storing memories. He was erasing a trail. He had a meeting with his business partner, a man he'd known for 20 years, and explained the need to step away indefinitely, citing family medical concerns. He liquidated his shares, the significant sum transferred not into a college fund, but into a war chest. Each action was a clean, deliberate cut, severing a tie to the man he used to be. The final trigger came on a Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, staring at another untouched cup of coffee, when a news alert flashed on his phone. HPD officer cleared an internal probe, slated for promotion. His thumb trembled as he clicked the link. The face of Kevin Cooper stared back at him from the screen, confident and unbothered. The article praised his distinguished service and announced his promotion to the rank of sergeant. The system wasn't just protecting its own, it was rewarding them. It was the ultimate, contemptuous validation of his entire dark thesis. Any microscopic, lingering ember of doubt was instantly extinguished. He didn't rage. He didn't break anything. He calmly stood up, walked out to his car, and made a call on a prepaid burner phone. "Charles," he said when the line connected. "It's time. I'm ready for that last question." The meeting took place in the back of a 24-hour auto shop deep in a part of Houston he'd only ever seen on maps. The air was thick with the smell of motor oil and welding fumes. Charles's contact was a man known only as Amir, who assessed Robert with the cool, professional detachment of a surgeon. He wasn't a thug. He was a businessman providing a specific, illicit service. You sure about this? Amir asked, his voice low and even. This isn't like buying a lawnmower from the hardware store. There's no returns policy. I'm not looking to return it, Robert replied, his own voice steady, surprising himself. I'm looking for insurance. Amir studied Robert's face for a long moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Insurance? Right. Well, this kind of policy has a very high premium. He turned and retrieved a heavy object wrapped in an oily cloth, placing it on a workbench between them. He unwrapped it. A black, untraceable 9mm handgun lay on the grease-stained fabric, its form purely functional, its purpose absolute. Robert reached out and picked it up. The weight of it in his hand felt final. It was heavier than any tool he had ever held, heavy with the gravity of a choice from which there could be no return. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. The meticulous, rule-following engineer who had raised his son to respect authority was gone, erased by a system that respected none of its own rules. In his place was a man with nothing left to lose, holding a physical manifestation of his new, terrible identity. Robert carefully placed the handgun into a new, locked case and stored it in the bottom of a closet. The acquisition of the tool was complete. Now came the design phase of its use. He returned to his desk, the heat of the weapon's finality still tingling on his palms. He opened his laptop, not to a blank search bar, but to the detailed, encrypted files he had spent weeks compiling. The 4 officers' lives were laid out before him like a set of complex blueprints. He analyzed the data with the dispassionate eye of an engineer assessing structural vulnerabilities. Cooper was the ultimate target, but he was volatile and now, likely paranoid. Sanchez and Wilson were weaker, but less central to the initial crime. Then there was Detective Thomas Mills. His predictable, corrupt routine, the bi-weekly visits to his mistress, was a design flaw, a point of entry. Robert made his decision, not based on emotion, but on strategy. The first domino to fall would be Mills. For the next 3 weeks, Robert became a ghost. His existence a series of patient observations from the seat of an anonymous work van he'd purchased with cash in Austin. He learned the rhythm of Detective Mills's life, not the sanitized version on the department's website, but the real, sordid one. He saw the casual arrogance in the way Mills parked his unmarked car in a fire lane, the lazy cruelty in how he berated a street vendor for being too slow, the bored entitlement on his face as he unlocked the door to his mistress Jessica Reyes' apartment building on Tuesdays and Thursdays like clockwork. Robert wasn't just gathering data on a target, he was studying the soul of a corrupt man, and what he saw there only hardened his resolve. He utilized his engineering expertise to create detailed schematics of the building and its surroundings, identifying every security camera, every blind spot, every possible escape route. He mapped the patterns of the neighbors and the delivery schedules. 2 weeks prior, posing as a tenant who had locked himself out, he had a local locksmith duplicate the building's service entrance key. The security was laughably inadequate, relying more on the illusion of safety than on actual technology. On the chosen day, a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, Robert transformed himself. The crisp, professional engineer was gone, replaced by a man in a gray maintenance uniform, complete with a fake company ID clipped to his breast pocket and a clipboard in his hand. He was invisible, another blue-collar worker in a city full of them. He parked the van on a quiet side street 2 blocks away and walked, his pulse surprisingly steady. All emotion had been suppressed, packed away into a cold, dark box in his mind. All that remained was the plan. At 2:20 p.m., he used the duplicate key to let himself in through the building's service entrance. He made his way silently up the back stairwell to the 3rd floor and slipped into a small utility closet near Jessica's apartment. He left the door cracked just enough to see the hallway. Then, he waited. The air in the closet was stuffy, smelling of dust and cleaning chemicals. He could hear the life of the building around him, a distant television, the hum of the elevator, the muffled sounds of a door closing down the hall. The weight of the tools in his jacket pocket was a heavy comfort. A taser, a telescoping steel baton, and the 9mm handgun, which he had no intention of using unless the plan went irrevocably wrong. At 3:40 p.m., exactly on schedule, the door to apartment 3B opened. Detective Thomas Mills emerged, adjusting his tie, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. Before he could take 2 steps toward the elevator, Robert moved. He stepped out of the closet, a gray phantom in the quiet hallway. There was no time for Mills to register more than a flicker of surprise before Robert raised the taser and fired. The sharp crackle of electricity filled the air, and the 2 barbs slammed into Mills's chest. The detective's body went rigid, a choked grunt escaping his lips as the shock sent him crashing to his knees. Before he could recover, Robert was on him, a swift, powerful blow from the steel baton connecting with the side of his head. Mills collapsed to the cheap hallway carpet, unconscious. Working with brutal efficiency, Robert dragged the dead weight of the detective back into Jessica's apartment, knowing she wouldn't return from her dispatch shift for hours. He secured Mills to a sturdy kitchen chair with a set of heavy-duty zip ties he pulled from his pocket. He then methodically swept the apartment for weapons, his movements calm and precise. He found Mills's service pistol in its shoulder holster, draped over a chair, and a smaller backup weapon strapped to his ankle. He secured them both and placed them on the kitchen counter, well out of reach. When Mills regained consciousness, it was to a throbbing headache and the confusing sight of his own mistress's kitchen. Then he saw the man in the maintenance uniform and the laptop computer sitting on the table in front of him. The laptop screen flickered to life, displaying the full, unedited video of Daniel Washington's beating, footage Robert had obtained from Olivia, who had received it from a sympathetic clerk in the evidence room. "Watch it," Robert commanded, his voice a low, unrecognizable rasp filtered through a small voice modulator. All of it. The video played. It showed Daniel, hands raised, complying. It showed Cooper's unprovoked assault. It showed the ensuing beating, all 4 officers participating to varying degrees. And it clearly showed Thomas Mills, after the initial takedown, moving to deliberately block the view of a bystander who was recording the incident with their phone. "What do you want? Money?" Mills slurred, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. "I can get you money. I want you to explain to me why you falsified your report," the modulated voice said. "Why you claimed a 17-year-old honor student attacked 4 armed officers." Recognition, followed by a flash of arrogant defiance, dawned in Mills's eyes. "Washington, you're the kid's father." He let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You're making a huge mistake. Answer the question." "Look, these things happen," Mills sneered. The kid mouthed off. "Cooper lost his temper. It happens. Especially with you people, always running your mouths, never knowing when to shut up and comply." The casual racism, the utter lack of remorse, it crystallized everything for Robert. This man was not just an accessory to a crime. He was a willing part of the culture that created it. "Cooper started it," Robert said, his disguised voice cold as ice. "But you all joined in. Then you covered it up. Whatever you're planning, it won't bring your kid back." Mills spat, his eyes darting toward his service pistol on the counter. "You'll go to prison. And for what? We're cops. The system protects us, not you." "You're right about one thing," Robert said, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "The system protects you, but it can't protect you from me. Death would be too quick, too merciful." Robert needed Mills to live, to feel a fraction of the helplessness his son had felt. He raised the 9mm handgun. The sound of the first shot was deafening in the small apartment. Mills screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony as the bullet shattered his left kneecap, his body convulsing against the zip ties. "That's for what you did to my son's leg," Robert said calmly. He aimed again. A second shot destroyed Mills's other knee. And that's so you remember what it feels like to be helpless every single day for the rest of your life. He didn't kill him. Instead, he left the detective bleeding and broken, but alive. Before he left, he taped a small, plastic flash drive to Mills's chest. On it was detailed evidence of the detective's involvement in a protection racket for drug dealers in West Houston, information Robert had purchased from one of Amir's associates. It was a gift that would ensure that even if Mills recovered, his life and career were over. Robert slipped out of the apartment, leaving the detective's first faint screams for help behind him. He stripped off the maintenance uniform in a back stairwell, stuffing it into a trash bag. By the time the first neighbor cautiously opened their door, Robert was 3 blocks away, sliding into the anonymity of rush hour traffic in his nondescript van. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the cold, vast silence of a man who had just crossed a line and had no intention of ever looking back. Robert drove for an hour, taking a circuitous route through the city's anonymous arteries before returning to the industrial park that housed his storage unit. Inside the windowless concrete box, under the stark light of a single bare bulb, he worked with the methodical calm of a surgeon after a complex procedure. He cleaned and stored his tools, stripped off his clothes and sealed them in a heavy-duty trash bag, and wiped down every surface he had touched. There was no elation, no satisfaction, only the quiet completion of a necessary task. When he was finished, he sat on a metal stool and switched on a handheld police scanner, its crackle and static filling the silence. He was no longer just the hunter, he was now an unseen observer, waiting to gauge the tremor from the first domino he had just pushed over. He didn't have to wait long. The initial calls were confused. A report of a man down and possible gunfire. Then a patrol officer arrived on scene, his voice tight with shock as he identified the victim as Detective Thomas Mills. The radio traffic exploded. The attack sent shockwaves of anger and fear through the Houston Police Department. The initial theory, formed in the heat of the moment and fueled by the discovery of the flash drive on Mills's chest, was unanimous. Gang retaliation. Mills had dirty dealings, and they had finally caught up with him. The department, eager for a simple narrative, clung to this explanation. No one, not for a moment, connected the brutal, calculated attack to the grieving father of a comatose teenager across town. No one, that is, except Lieutenant Sarah Wells. The case's high-profile nature and the clear evidence of internal corruption on the flash drive meant the FBI was brought in. But Wells, a veteran HPD homicide detective with a reputation for ignoring political convenience, was assigned to lead the local investigation. In the first major briefing, she stood before a whiteboard filled with preliminary findings and dismissed the prevailing theory with a wave of her hand. "So let me get this straight," she said, her voice cutting through the room's angry murmur. "One of our detectives gets his knees professionally shattered, an attack designed for maximum pain and lifelong crippling, not a quick death. The assailant leaves behind a flash drive detailing his corruption, essentially gift-wrapping a federal case for us, and we're supposed to believe this is a simple gang hit? It's too clean. It feels personal. It feels like a message." A senior captain, a man from the old guard, shifted in his chair. "Sarah, Mills swam with sharks. He was bound to get bit." "Maybe," Wells conceded, turning back to the board. "But this isn't about money or territory. This is about punishment. The style is wrong for a drug crew. This is an execution of a different kind." She paused and then picked up a dry erase marker. "Pull everything related to the Washington kid, the excessive force complaint against Mills, Cooper, and the others." She looked around the room. "I want to know where the father was when this happened." While her colleagues pursued leads in the criminal underworld, Wells pursued a ghost. Her request for a warrant to pull Robert Washington's digital records was initially met with skepticism, but she pushed it through. What she found was the missing link. It wasn't just a few searches. It was a methodical, deep dive investigation. She found search histories for the personal lives, assets, and known associates of all 4 officers. She found cached pages of property records and social media profiles. It was a blueprint of their lives. In the department strategy meeting, she laid it out. "This is our man," she argued. But her superiors were reluctant to believe an engineer with a spotless record and a security clearance could be capable of such violence. The system's gears were beginning to turn, slowly and silently. One evening, Robert's burner phone buzzed. It was Charles. "Robert, they're not just looking, they're hunting." Charles's voice was low and urgent. "My contact at the courthouse says a Lieutenant Wells has been pulling your records, phone, financials, everything. She's different. She's not part of the old boys club. She's a bulldog." Robert stood in his sparse apartment, looking out the window at the city lights. "Let her hunt. They're looking for a monster. They won't see a grieving father." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Be careful, Robert," Charles said, his voice heavy. "A grieving father with a purpose is the most dangerous kind of monster there is." The next day, at the hospital, something shifted. During a routine neurological check, a doctor was testing Daniel's response to stimuli. Robert watched as he always did, his heart a dull, aching weight in his chest. The doctor applied firm pressure to the nail bed of Daniel's left hand, and his fingers twitched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but Robert saw it. His breath caught in his throat. The doctor, seeing the flicker, tried again, this time on his foot. Daniel's leg moved, a definite, if weak, reflex. It was the first voluntary movement he had made in nearly 2 months, a surge of pure, unadulterated hope, so powerful it almost made Robert's knees buckle. Washed over him, it was a sign. His son was still in there, fighting his way back. The knowledge didn't deter him from his path, it sanctified it. He wasn't just fighting for vengeance anymore. He was fighting for the future that Daniel might now actually have. That evening, he was in his apartment, the television on mute, scrolling through news sites on his laptop. The lead story was still the attack on Detective Mills. Then he saw it. A local news station had published a new article. He clicked the link. The headline was a question that made his blood run cold and his heart beat faster. Is attack on HPD detective connected to controversial police brutality case? Below it were 2 pictures side by side, the official department photo of Thomas Mills and a school picture of Daniel Washington. The public connection had been made. The narrative was no longer under the police department's control. Robert stared at the screen, a cold, thin smile touching his lips for the first time in months. The pressure was building. The cold smile faded from Robert's lips as the news segment ended. The public connection was a victory, but a dangerous one. It confirmed his strategy was working on a macro level, but it also painted a target squarely on his back. He knew Lieutenant Wells, the bulldog, would now have the political capital she needed to intensify her surveillance. The persona of the grieving father, once a perfect cover, was becoming transparent. He was a person of interest, and any move he made would be scrutinized. To act again, he couldn't just be careful. He needed to be a ghost. He needed to create an illusion so convincing that it would give him the one thing he needed most, a window of time where no one was watching. The performance began the next morning. Using his primary, monitored cell phone, Robert made a series of calls. He spoke to his business partner, his voice tinged with a carefully crafted, weary resignation, telling him he needed to get away from it all for a while. He called his sister in another state, loudly discussing plans to fly to Chicago to stay with family and clear his head until this nightmare is over. His words, he knew, were not for his sister, but for the listening ears of the investigation. That evening, he made a show of packing 2 large suitcases, making sure he was visible through the window of his apartment. He loaded them into his personal car, not the anonymous van, and drove to the airport. Under the harsh glare of the sodium lights in the long-term parking structure, he paid for a week's parking and walked, with the slumped shoulders of a defeated man, toward the terminal entrance. The surveillance team, if they were there, would log him as heading for his flight, another grieving father fleeing his pain. But once inside the sprawling concrete maze of the garage, Robert's posture changed. He moved with purpose, using the connecting walkways and elevator shafts to circle back, unseen. In a prepaid locker on a different level, he retrieved a simple duffel bag. He exited on the opposite side of the structure, hailed a pre-booked rideshare, and disappeared into the city's traffic. He was a ghost now, having shed his monitored identity for a few crucial days. He checked into a nondescript motel on the industrial outskirts of town, using a fake ID and cash. The grieving father was in the air, on his way to Chicago. The hunter was in Houston, preparing for his next move. His target was Officer David Sanchez. From his weeks of research, Robert knew Sanchez was the weak link. He was younger than the others, a follower, not a leader, with a house he couldn't quite afford and, according to whispers on public forums, a significant gambling problem. He was a man under pressure, a man who might break. From the anonymity of the motel room, Robert used a new burner phone and a text message spoofing app. The message, sent to Sanchez's personal phone, was designed to mimic the street-level urgency of a confidential informant. Got something big on the port shipment. Cops crawling everywhere. Meet me at the old cannery. Warehouse 7. Come alone. Burn this. It was a perfect lure, playing on both greed and police procedure. The abandoned warehouse district was a graveyard of industry, a place of rust and shadows on the edge of the city. Robert arrived hours early, his anonymous van parked blocks away. He scouted the cavernous interior of Warehouse 7, a vast space that smelled of decay and stagnant water. He set up a single battery-powered speaker, placed a lone wooden chair in the center of a wide-open space, and then retreated into the deep, oppressive shadows of the upper catwalks, a ghost waiting for his guest. Sanchez arrived alone, as instructed. He entered the warehouse cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. "Hello? Jimmy sent me," he called out, using the established code name. "Officer Sanchez." Robert's modulated voice echoed from the hidden speaker, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Thank you for coming alone." "Who am I talking to?" Sanchez demanded, drawing his weapon now, his head swiveling, trying to pinpoint the source of the disembodied voice. Someone interested in justice for Daniel Washington. The name hit Sanchez like a physical blow. His posture changed instantly, the false bravado evaporating, replaced by raw, visible tension. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," the voice from the shadows continued, cold and relentless. "I think you remember holding down a 17-year-old boy while your colleagues beat him unconscious. I think you remember falsifying your report afterward." Robert stepped from the shadows of the catwalk, his own gun trained steadily on the officer below. In that moment, he felt no satisfaction, only the hollow certainty that he was too far down this path to turn back. Sanchez's face crumpled. "Look, I didn't have a choice," he blurted out, his eyes darting around the empty space as if looking for an escape. "Cooper was my superior officer. He said the kid swung at him first. But you knew that wasn't true," Robert said, his real voice cold and quiet, cutting through the air. "What was I supposed to do, report him?" Sanchez's voice cracked, and tears began to stream down his face. "You don't rat on other cops if you want to keep your job, or your teeth. It's the first thing they teach you. Not at the academy, but in the squad car. It's the real law. You go against it, and you're the one who needs backup and finds no one's coming. I have a family. Man, a mortgage." He wasn't like Mills. There was no arrogance, no racist sneer. There was only the pathetic, complete breakdown of a weak man confessing his own cowardice. The raw, genuine remorse in Sanchez's voice created an unexpected moral complication. Robert had come to punish a monster, but the man sobbing before him was just a coward. The clear, hard lines of his mission blurred. Before he could process this unexpected dilemma, a distant sound intruded on the silence of the warehouse. The faint, rising wail of police sirens. They were growing closer, Fast. Lieutenant Wells, smarter and quicker than he had anticipated, must have traced the text. The sound shocked Sanchez out of his sobbing. His survival instinct flared, now mixed with his confessed guilt. "They're coming for you," he said, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He lowered his weapon slightly. "But I can help you. If you let me go now, I'll tell them you were never here." He took a ragged breath. "And I'll do what you asked. I'll do the right thing. The thing I was too much of a coward to do that day. I'll testify. I'll wear a wire. I'll give you Cooper. Please, let me make it right." Robert stared at him, the sirens now a screaming, undeniable reality. The flashing blue and red lights began to strobe against the grimy warehouse windows. It was a split-second, high-stakes choice. Trust the coward who had already failed once, or follow through. But following through was no longer an option. He made the gamble. "If you're lying to me," Robert warned, his voice a low promise, "you'll wish I had shot you here tonight." He lowered his weapon and backed away toward a rusted fire escape he had identified earlier. The sounds of tactical commands and boots on gravel were now audible just outside the main door. "I'm not lying," Sanchez insisted, his voice filled with a desperate sincerity. "What happened to your son was wrong. All of it." Robert disappeared through the service exit and into the night, the sound of the main door being breached echoing behind him. He was a ghost once more, leaving chaos and a single, fragile promise of justice in his wake. The days that followed the warehouse encounter were a special kind of hell for Robert. He was a man of action and precision, now forced into a state of absolute inaction and uncertainty. Confined to the stale air of the motel room, he could only wait, monitoring news reports and the crackle of the police scanner, searching for any sign that his gamble on Sanchez had paid off. The city he once helped build now felt like a cage. Every distant siren made his heart seize. He didn't know if he had made a fatal mistake or a brilliant strategic move. Then, 3 days into his self-imposed exile, a coded text arrived from Charles. "The package is in motion. Hope, sharp and dangerous. Cut through the tension." Sanchez had kept his word. True to his word, a terrified but resolute David Sanchez had met with internal affairs. He agreed to wear a wire. The setup was a masterpiece of manipulation. Sanchez, feigning panic and seeking advice, met Kevin Cooper in Cooper's own living room in the Woodlands, a bottle of whiskey between them as a prop for false camaraderie. For 3 hours, the tiny microphone captured every damning word. "You show weakness on the street, you're dead." Cooper slurred on his fourth drink, his voice thick with arrogance. "You let one of them get away with mouthing off. The next one thinks they can pull a knife. You establish dominance. First time, every time. That kid learned a lesson." "But a Coma, man," Sanchez ventured, his own voice a carefully pitched imitation of a nervous colleague. "That's not a lesson. That's a death sentence." Cooper waved a dismissive hand. He should have thought of that before he decided to be a thug. "It's a jungle out there. David, you gotta be the lion." The recording, delivered anonymously to Lieutenant Sarah Wells, was devastating. Combined with Officer Scott Wilson's subsequent decision to also come forward, fearing he might be the vigilante's next target, the department had no choice but to act. What nobody anticipated was Cooper's reaction. After being escorted from the precinct, stripped of his badge and service weapon, his face a mask of incandescent rage, he did not go home to await trial. He went to a safe, retrieved a personal firearm, and disappeared. An analysis of his recent purchases revealed a disturbing pattern: ammunition, high-end survival gear, and a one-way car rental. He wasn't just running, he was planning something desperate. But Robert, using his own digital surveillance and a tip from Charles's network, was a step ahead of HPD and the FBI. He tracked Cooper not to an airport or a border crossing, but to a remote, isolated cabin deep in the Texas Hill Country, a property owned by a disgraced former officer who had been dismissed for excessive force years earlier. It was the perfect place to make a final stand. What Cooper didn't realize was that Robert had arrived first. a ghost in the dense, silent woods. Robert watched from a concealed position as the disgraced officer unloaded his vehicle. Through binoculars, he could see Cooper was heavily armed, carrying multiple weapons inside with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. This confrontation would be the most dangerous by far. Cooper was trained, desperate, and unlike the others, expecting trouble. But Robert had come too far to turn back. Night fell over the mountains, bringing with it a heavy silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional call of a nocturnal bird. Under the cover of darkness, Robert moved with a hunter's patience, placing small, sophisticated motion sensors at strategic points around the cabin's perimeter before retreating to observe. Inside, Cooper paced restlessly, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, periodically peering out the windows with the raw paranoia of a man who knows he's being hunted. Near midnight, one of the sensors on the north side of the cabin triggered a silent alert on Robert's phone. Cooper had emerged onto the cabin's porch, a high-powered rifle in hand, scanning the impenetrable tree line. "I know you're out there. Washington!" he shouted into the darkness, his voice a drunken, venomous roar. "You think I didn't figure it out? That you're the one who shot Mills? Who turned Sanchez and Wilson into rats?" Robert remained motionless in his concealed position, 100 yards away, watching as Cooper fired several rounds into the forest. The muzzle flashed a series of angry orange blossoms in the dark. The bullets tore through the trees, nowhere near his actual location. "Your kid was garbage," Cooper continued, his slurred words echoing through the quiet hills. "Just another street thug who didn't know his place. I did the community a favor. I cleaned up the trash." The naked racism, the complete lack of remorse even now, confirmed for Robert that his course of action was the only one. This man would never face true justice within the system. He would hire an expensive lawyer, claim PTSD, and receive a minimal sentence at most. Robert circled to a new position and deliberately triggered another sensor on the far side of the property. As Cooper whirled toward the sound, firing wildly, Robert sprinted to the back of the cabin, slipping through a rear window he had unlocked hours earlier. Inside, he quickly located and disabled Cooper's phones before positioning himself in the darkened kitchen, waiting. The confrontation, when it came, was explosive. Cooper burst back through the front door, sensing an intruder, and immediately opened fire in Robert's direction. A bullet tore through the flesh of Robert's left arm as he dove for cover behind a solid oak table. "You're dead, Washington!" Cooper screamed, fumbling to reload his weapon. "Just like your worthless son will be when they finally pull the plug." But Robert had not come unprepared. He rolled, pulling a small, cylindrical object from his jacket. He triggered the device and tossed it into the center of the room, a military-grade flashbang grenade procured by Charles. The disorienting blast of light and sound was deafening, giving Robert the precious seconds he needed. He launched himself at Cooper, tackling him with the full force of his body. The two men crashed through a glass coffee table, landing in a shower of shattered glass. They grappled violently on the floor. Cooper's police combat training, even dulled by alcohol, gave him a savage edge. He managed to land several powerful blows, reopening the wound on Robert's arm. "I've killed better men than you," Cooper grunted, his hand reaching for a large hunting knife sheath at his belt. "You people never learn your place." As the knife arced toward him, Robert managed to deflect Cooper's wrist with desperate strength, the blade slicing deep into the wooden floor, inches from his face. He drove his knee hard into Cooper's midsection, creating just enough space to reach the taser in his own jacket. He jammed the electrodes square into Cooper's chest, the electric shock causing the larger man to convulse and drop the knife. Robert scrambled away, retrieving his fallen handgun and training it on the incapacitated officer. "My son was 17, Robert said, his voice a ragged gasp, blood dripping from a new cut above his eye. "He was going to study engineering, follow in my footsteps. Should have taught him to respect authority," Cooper wheezed, still defiant. "I taught him to be a good man," Robert replied, clicking on a small digital recorder. Something you know nothing about. Now you're going to confess to what you did to him and to all the others before him. Go to hell. Confess, Robert said, pressing the barrel of the gun to Cooper's temple. Or I'll send you there first. For the next 30 minutes, under the immediate threat of death, Cooper talked. His voice, stripped of its arrogance, was a low, defeated mumble. He detailed years of excessive force incidents, racist policies within the department, and the systematic cover-ups that had protected officers like him. His words, captured clearly on the recording, implicated not just himself, but supervisors and union representatives who had helped bury complaints. When it was over, as Robert prepared to deliver his final judgment, Cooper made one last, desperate lunge for a backup weapon concealed beneath the sofa cushions. In the ensuing struggle for the small pistol, it discharged. The bullet struck Cooper high in the abdomen, the impact throwing him back against the sofa. Robert stood over the bleeding, gasping officer, his own weapon now aimed squarely at Cooper's head. His finger tensed on the trigger. Everything in him, every fiber of his being, screamed for him to end the man who had so callously destroyed his son's future. But something stopped him. Not mercy. It was the realization that death would be too quick, too clean for a man like Cooper. You'll live, Robert told him, his voice flat as he knelt and applied a basic pressure bandage to the wound. You'll stand trial. You'll spend years in prison where everyone will know you were a cop. And every day, you'll feel a fraction of the helplessness my son has felt. He used Cooper's own handcuffs to secure him to a heavy support beam, leaving the digital recorder with its damning confession prominently displayed on the floor beside him. He took one of Cooper's burner phones and walked out into the cool night air. He dialed 911. Shots fired at the old Miller cabin off Route 46, he said, then ended the call and tossed the phone deep into the woods. He melted back into the forest, leaving the wounded lion for the jackals of the system he had just exposed. The trek back through the darkened forest was a brutal, pain-filled ordeal. The adrenaline that had fueled Robert through the fight was gone, leaving only the throbbing protest of his wounded arm and the deep ache of exhausted muscles. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. He finally reached a predetermined rendezvous point where Charles Lewis was waiting with a car. As Charles expertly stitched the gash on his arm in a dimly lit safe house hours later, Robert felt a profound emptiness settle over him. The singular burning purpose that had driven him for months was fulfilled. He had climbed his mountain, and now, on the other side, there was nothing. While Robert disappeared into the anonymous suburbs of Houston, Lieutenant Sarah Wells and her tactical team were converging on the remote cabin. They moved with silent, professional coordination, breaching the property just before dawn. They found the scene exactly as Robert had left it, a trashed living room smelling of whiskey and gunpowder, and Officer Kevin Cooper, bleeding and semi-conscious, handcuffed to a support beam. Beside him on the floor, its small red light blinking like a patient heart, was a digital recorder. Wells knelt, her expression unreadable, and pressed play. At that exact moment, miles away in the sterile quiet of Houston General Hospital, something miraculous was happening. Daniel Washington's eyelids, immobile for 87 days, fluttered. The steady beep of the heart monitor connected to him quickened its rhythm slightly. Dr. Patel, making her morning rounds, noticed the change immediately. "Daniel, can you hear me?" she asked, shining a penlight into his eyes. His pupils, once sluggish, responded. His cracked lips parted, forming a single, raw whisper. "Dad?" The doctor's professional composure broke for a second, a wide smile spreading across her face. "Daniel, welcome back. Can you tell me your name?" His voice was weak, raspy from disuse. "Daniel Washington. Where's my dad?" His eyes, though clouded with confusion, searched the room with a singular, desperate focus. The news traveled through Charles's network with the speed of an electric current. He found Robert staring out the window of the safe house, a ghost haunted by the violence he had committed. "Robert," Charles said, his voice gentle but firm. "The hospital called. He's awake." "Robert," your boy opened his eyes. The world, which had been a gray, featureless landscape, suddenly exploded into sharp, painful color. Robert turned from the window, his face a mask of disbelief, then dawning, unbearable joy, immediately followed by a fresh wave of agony. His son was awake. His son was asking for him, and he couldn't go. He was a fugitive, a hunter with the city's most determined investigator on his trail. "I need to see him," Robert said, the words an undeniable imperative. "They'll be watching for you," Charles warned. "Wells is smart. She'll have officers stationed there, waiting for you to make a mistake." "I don't care," Robert said, his new purpose already solidifying. "My son needs me." With Charles's help, he transformed himself one last time, not into a maintenance worker or a ghost in the woods, but into a patient, dressed in a hospital gown over his clothes, a surgical mask covering the lower half of his face, and sitting in a wheelchair. He became just another broken person in a building full of them. A sympathetic nurse, a member of the support group, met them at a side entrance. She guided him through a maze of service corridors and back elevators, a hidden geography of the hospital that bypassed all security cameras and official checkpoints. When he finally entered Daniel's room, the sight of his son's open eyes, confused but alert, shattered the hardened shell Robert had built around his heart. He moved to the bedside, his own wounds and exhaustion forgotten, and took his son's hand. "Dad." Daniel's voice was stronger now, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his face. "What happened?" "You're going to be okay now, son," Robert said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Everything's going to be okay." "I remember police," Daniel said, fragments of memory surfacing like wreckage from a deep ocean. "They stopped me walking home from Chris's house. I had his weed in my pocket." Fear flickered across his face, the memory still raw. "They started hitting me. I didn't fight back. Dad, I swear I didn't." "I know, son," Robert said, squeezing his hand. "I know you didn't." Meanwhile, across town, Lieutenant Sarah Wells sat in her office, listening to the recording from the cabin. The contents were more damning than she could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just a confession to the assault on Daniel. It was a detailed, rambling indictment of a departmental culture. Cooper named supervisors who had encouraged a heavy-handed approach, union representatives who taught officers how to phrase reports to justify any level of force, and a dozen other incidents of racism and cover-ups. It was a bomb, and she was holding the detonator. She took it to District Attorney Catherine Rivers. "So you're vigilante," the DA said, her voice dripping with cynicism after listening to a portion of the tape, "has single-handedly exposed a level of corruption I can't ignore. And you want me to give him a medal?" "I want you to be smart, Catherine," Wells responded, her tone all business. "We can prosecute Robert Washington for assault and kidnapping, and he becomes a martyr, a folk hero. The public will turn on us for protecting a pack of criminal cops. Or one, as we can use the evidence he risked everything to get, and we can clean house. We control the narrative. We become the reformers." The political logic was undeniable. The DA's office announced it was offering Robert Washington full immunity in exchange for his testimony. That evening, Wells arrived at the hospital alone. She dismissed the uniformed officers, maintaining a discreet presence in the hallway, and entered Daniel's room, where Robert sat beside his sleeping son. "Mr. Washington," she said quietly. Robert looked up, his face calm. "Your son is a miracle," Wells said. "What you did is a felony. Several, in fact. What you and your department did to my son," Robert replied, his voice soft but edged with steel. "What's the word for that, Lieutenant?" Wells' expression didn't change, but her eyes held a flicker of understanding. "The word for that is unforgivable," she said, "which is why DA Rivers is willing to make a deal." Ha! She reached into her jacket and placed a folded document on the bedside table. An arrest warrant, with his name on it. This warrant becomes active in 24 hours. My superiors expect me to execute it. What you do with that time is up to you." She paused, her gaze shifting from Robert to the sleeping form of his son. "But know this, your son needs a father, not a memory." She turned and left the room. Robert sat in the quiet, watching the steady rise and fall of his son's chest. He looked at the warrant, a stark, official contract from the world he had declared war on. He now had a choice he never thought he'd have: disappear with his son and live as a fugitive, or walk into the heart of the system he had sought to destroy and become its most unlikely agent of change. Robert spent the night in the uncomfortable recliner beside his son's bed, the arrest warrant a pale rectangle in the dim light of the heart monitor. He didn't sleep. He watched Daniel breathe, the easy, steady rhythm, a miracle he would never take for granted again. He weighed the two futures Wells had offered him. One was a life in the shadows, a fugitive existence where his son's future would be forever tied to his father's past. The other was a life in the harsh glare of the public eye, a path that required him to walk back into the heart of the broken system he had just waged war against. Toward dawn, as the first gray light began to filter through the window, he made his decision. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the number for Charles Lewis, the number that meant escape. He deleted it. Then he dialed the number for Olivia Martinez. 24 hours later, Robert Washington walked up the steps of the Houston courthouse. It was a calculated media event, orchestrated by Olivia. The steps teemed with protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers. Robert, flanked by Olivia on one side and Charles Lewis on the other, approached the bank of microphones. "I stand here today not as a vigilante seeking revenge," he stated, his voice steady and clear, carrying across the hushed crowd, "but as a father who was failed by every institution meant to protect my son. What I did was born of desperation, not malice. I only hope that from this tragedy, real change will emerge." He then turned and walked inside to surrender himself to the authorities, accepting the DA's deal. The trial that followed became a referendum not just on 4 officers, but on American policing itself. For 3 weeks, the courtroom heard testimony that laid bare the patterns of excessive force, racial profiling, and institutional cover-ups that had persisted for decades. Officers Scott Wilson and David Sanchez, gaunt and humbled, provided crucial insider testimony. "We had a name for it," Scott Wilson testified, his voice barely above a whisper. "The blue wall. It was a mindset. We were taught to see the worst in people, and in certain neighborhoods, we didn't have to look very hard because we were already told what we would find. We were told there are wolves, sheep, and sheepdogs in the world, and that anyone from certain communities was automatically considered a wolf." The most powerful testimony came from Lieutenant, now Captain, Sarah Wells. Her meticulous documentation of department misconduct, combined with the full, unedited confession from Kevin Cooper's recorder, painted an undeniable picture of a culture that rewarded aggression and protected abusers. Cooper and Thomas Mills appeared in court in wheelchairs, their injuries a visible, silent testament to Robert's campaign. Cooper remained defiant to the end, his testimony filled with thinly veiled racism and justifications. Mills, however, seemed broken, admitting to his role in falsifying reports throughout his career. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The city held its breath. The foreman read the verdict in a clear voice: "Guilty, on all counts, for all 4 officers." A wave of quiet, tearful relief swept through the community members gathered in the courtroom. Cooper and Mills received the harshest sentences, 15 years each, with no possibility of parole for at least 10. But the most extraordinary moment came during Judge John Richardson's sentencing statement, when he addressed Robert's immunity agreement. The court recognizes that Mr. Washington's actions, while technically criminal, arose from circumstances no parent should ever face, the judge declared, his voice resonating with authority. When systems of justice fail so completely that citizens feel compelled to seek justice outside the law, We must examine not just individual actions, but institutional failures. This court will not punish the symptom. It will instead task him with helping to cure the disease. In an unprecedented decision that sent shockwaves through the legal community, the judge formalized Robert's immunity, but added a condition. Robert Washington would serve as a founding civilian member of a newly formed police oversight commission, tasked with helping to reform the very department that had nearly destroyed his family. 3 months later, Daniel Washington, leaning on a walker but standing tall, sat in the front row of the Houston Police Academy auditorium. On the stage, his father addressed a class of new recruits, standing alongside Captain Sarah Wells. "The badge isn't power," Robert told the sea of young, earnest faces. "It's responsibility. Every person you encounter is someone's child, someone's loved one. Remember my son's story before you ever raise your hand in anger or look away when a colleague crosses the line." The transformation had begun. An independent civilian review board now had real authority. Body cameras were mandatory, and Robert and Daniel had used the substantial settlement funds from the city to establish the Washington Foundation for Police Accountability, providing legal support to victims and scholarships for reform-minded students entering law enforcement. Later, as father and son drove home from the academy, a comfortable silence settled between them. The car was a private, peaceful space in a world that had been so loud and violent. "Dad," Daniel said quietly, breaking the silence. "When you were out there, were you scared?" Robert glanced at his son, the young man whose future had been so nearly stolen, who still attended therapy 3 times a week and would likely always carry the faint physical and emotional scars of that encounter. He thought for a long moment before answering honestly. "Every second," he said, his voice soft but clear. "But I was more scared of a world where what happened to you was just another Tuesday. I couldn't live in that world, and I couldn't leave you in it." He turned his eyes back to the road ahead, and for the first time in a very long time, the path forward seemed clear, and they were traveling it together.